Well, our study for 1 Peter chapter 2 today comes at a pretty appropriate time. It's a pretty appropriate passage. Our study is going to be in 1 Peter 2 verses 13 through 25 to the end of the chapter. And what's interesting to me is that we've come to this passage at a great time for us to read it. It's an election season, and this passage is all about submitting to authority and living in the right way, no matter who's in charge. It starts off with, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. But what's interesting, and I want to point out to this, is that we're not doing it for our sake, but we're doing it for the Lord's sake. We are submitting to authority in order to glorify and honor God. He goes on to say, such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. And this is the challenge that I want to emphasize in this passage. That Peter is telling his people, keep in mind that Peter is talking to people that feel like they're aliens, that they are foreigners in their own homeland, right? And they feel that way because of the relationship that they now have with Jesus himself. And they don't feel like they're at home anymore, even though they're in their own land. They haven't moved to another country. They are in the same place, but they just feel like aliens. And this whole time, Peter's trying to encourage them to maintain the course, to stay in their faith. And so not only do they not feel at home, but now they feel like they're under a foreigner's rule. And he's saying, but you need to submit to that rule. You need to submit to that rule, and you need to live the right way. Because in doing so, no one's going to be able to say anything against you. By doing right, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. He goes on to challenge them and say, you know, if you do something wrong and if you sin and you're harshly treated and you endure it with patience, good for you. You deserved it, right? But he says, but if you do what's right and you suffer and you endure it patiently, then you find favor with God. So he's saying live right no matter the circumstances. If you sinned and you're suffering the consequences, do it with patience. Do it with grace, right? If you didn't do anything wrong and you still are suffering, endure it. Go through it with patience. Show some grace even in that. And in that, God finds favor. So this whole passage, and it's just a fitting thing for us to hear, that we need to submit to human authority. I don't think Peter would argue that we need to submit to human authority to the degree in which it would cause us to stray from God. That's not what he's saying. But we do need to respect and honor it. So, man, we need to respect and honor whoever is in authority over us, whether or not we like them, whether or not we voted for them, whether or not we agree with them, whether or not we feel like they're even treating us fairly. We still have a lifestyle that God has called us to live in, no matter what's going on around us. And he's telling us, and Peter's telling the folks that he's talking to, do right. Do right no matter what. Do right no matter what you're experiencing or what you're going through. He's saying, do right. And then the challenge that really gets to me in this is that at the end of this passage, he talks about Christ, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. So while he was being hated on, he didn't return that with more hate. He didn't argue back. He didn't even defend himself. Time and time again, Jesus meets his accusers with total silence. It goes on in verse 23. So while suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept on entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. He was living right in some unright circumstances, if we can put it that way. But he did it. He was able to do it. He was able to accomplish this life because he kept on entrusting himself. He kept on entrusting. He kept on putting into God's care. That's what entrusting means. And that Greek word, it means that he kept on doing it. He didn't just do it once. He did it over and over and over and over again. I think Jesus had to entrust himself to the Father every time he was hit, every time he was spit upon, every time he was ridiculed, every time he met persecution, he had to entrust himself. And the word himself that's in the New American Standards actually not in most of the original Greek texts, which is why in most of our Bibles that word himself is in italics, meaning that it's probably not there. So the object isn't necessarily identified as what he was entrusting. But obviously he was entrusting himself. We could also say he was entrusting his circumstances. He was entrusting God's plan. He was entrusting the situation. He was even entrusting his enemies and the very ones that were hitting him to God. He was giving all of those things to God. Folks, when we allow God to take total control of our life, it's easier for us to do right, because then we're not having to fight for or defend the things we think we deserve. We are trusting God with all of that. We are trusting God with the outcome of our politics. We are trusting God with the outcome of our society. We are trusting God with the outcome of our life. We are trusting God with our security and our peace. We are trusting God for our daily provisions. Like, we are entrusting ourselves and every aspect of our life to God. And when we do that, it enables us to live up to the rest of the challenge in this passage, which is to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Live right, whether you're suffering due consequences or not. Let's live right. And we can only live right if we have entrusted ourselves to God. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk more about that on Wednesday night on Zoom, and we'd love for you to join us. We'll send you the link. Let us know if you don't have it. Hopefully we'll see you there. But anyway, live right today. No matter what, live right to the glory of God.